Picture a cold, windy beach in December with nobody around except 5 witnesses and 2 bicycle mechanics from Ohio. No cameras rolling for the world, no crowd cheering, just sand, wind, and a strange wooden machine with cloth wings. Is this really how humanity first left the ground under its own power? The real story is stranger, quieter, and more brilliant than most people realize. You probably picture the Wright brothers' first flight as some grand, celebrated event. Newspapers screaming the news, crowds gasping in amazement. But almost none of that happened. So what actually took place on December 17th, 1903, and how did 2 men with no formal engineering training solve a problem that had defeated inventors, scientists, and even a well-funded government project? Start with who these 2 men actually were. Wilbur and Orville Wright ran a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. Bicycles might seem unrelated to flight, but they weren't. Building and repairing bicycles taught the brothers something crucial: balance. A bicycle only stays upright because a rider constantly makes tiny corrections. The Wrights believed an airplane would need the same thing: not raw power, control. That single idea separated them from almost every other inventor chasing flight at the time. Most competitors focused on building bigger engines or flatter wings, assuming power alone would solve the problem. The Wrights disagreed. They believed a pilot needed to actively steer and balance the aircraft in 3 directions at once, the same way a cyclist leans into a turn. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because it meant the Wrights weren't just building a flying machine. They were building a flying machine a human could actually control. So, how did they get from an idea to an actual flight? Step 1 was studying birds. Wilbur spent hours watching buzzards soar, noticing how they twisted the tips of their wings to turn and stabilize. That observation led to one of the Wrights' most important inventions: wing warping, a method of twisting the wings slightly to roll the aircraft left or right. It's the ancestor of the aileron, still used on airplanes today. Step 2 was testing. Before ever attempting powered flight, the Wrights flew gliders at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, chosen for its steady winds and soft, sandy landings. Their early gliders performed worse than expected. Instead of guessing why, they built something almost nobody else in aviation had: a wind tunnel. Inside a wooden box in their bicycle shop, they tested over 200 different wing shapes, carefully measuring lift and drag for each one. This wasn't trial and error. It was systematic engineering, decades before that kind of rigor became standard in aviation. Step 3 was the engine. No manufacturer made an engine light enough and powerful enough for their needs, so the Wrights built their own with help from their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. It produced just 12 horsepower, barely enough to power a modern lawnmower, yet it was enough to lift their aircraft off the ground. By December 1903, everything came together. On the morning of December 17th, near Kill Devil Hills, the wind was blowing at nearly 27 miles per hour, stronger than ideal. But the brothers decided to attempt it anyway. They had flipped a coin days earlier to decide who would go first. Orville won that toss. At 10:35 in the morning, Orville lay flat on the lower wing, hands on the controls, and the flyer lifted off the launching rail. The flight lasted 12 seconds. It covered about 120 feet, shorter than the wingspan of a modern jumbo jet. John T. Daniels, a local life-saving station volunteer, snapped the now famous photograph at the exact moment the machine left the ground. That wasn't the end of the day. The brothers alternated turns, and by the fourth and final flight, Wilbur flew for 59 seconds, covering 852 feet. It was the longest and most controlled flight of the day, though still short enough to fit inside a single city block stacked several times over. Here's the detail most people never learn. This achievement barely made news. The Wrights sent a telegram to their father describing the flights, and a local newspaper eventually printed a short, largely inaccurate article. Many major papers ignored the story entirely. Why did such a historic moment go almost unnoticed? Partly because the brothers were intensely private, refusing to demonstrate the aircraft publicly for years, worried that competitors would steal their design before they could patent it. It wasn't until 1908, nearly 5 years later, that the Wrights performed public demonstrations in the United States and France that finally convinced the world that powered, controlled flight was real. Now for the misconception worth correcting. Many people assume the Wright brothers were the very first humans to leave the ground in any kind of aircraft. That's not quite accurate. Hot air balloons had carried people aloft since the 1780s, and glider pioneers, including a German engineer named Otto Lilienthal, had already achieved controlled, unpowered flight years earlier. What the Wrights actually accomplished was different and arguably harder. They achieved the first sustained, controlled, and powered flight in a heavier-than-air machine, meaning an aircraft that could take off under its own power, fly in a controlled manner, and land without losing height the entire time. That distinction, powered and controlled together, is what makes December 17th, 1903, so significant. There's another myth worth clearing up. Just 9 days before the Wrights' success, a scientist named Samuel Langley, funded by the United States government with tens of thousands of dollars, launched his own flying machine, the Aerodrome, from a houseboat on the Potomac River. It crashed immediately into the water. Langley had far more funding and public attention than two bicycle mechanics from Ohio. Yet it was the Wrights' quiet, methodical approach that actually worked. So the next time you imagine that first flight, picture it accurately. Not a triumphant public spectacle, but a windy, half-empty beach, a handful of witnesses, and two brothers who spent years patiently studying birds, testing wings in a homemade wind tunnel, and treating balance as seriously as power. 12 seconds and 120 feet may not sound like much, but it was enough to change how humanity would move through the world forever.